Widow Eleanor Whitford was 37 years old when she saw the first structure that would change her life. Not a house, not a bridge spanning water, but a covered wooden bridge on an old Norwegian farm in Vermont, the place she and her husband visited during their only trip away from Frostbend Valley. The bridge looked utterly ordinary. Planks stretched across a small stream, a few weathered posts. But what made Eleanor stand still for a long time was the roof. The entire structure was enclosed, sheltered from rain, snow, and the slashing crosswinds typical of the eastern mountains. It created a dry, warm passage between two barns, a space where normally people had to expose themselves to the weather. "Why don't we connect our houses like this?" Eleanor asked her husband, running her hand along a sun-bleached beam. "Connect how?" Jonas raised an eyebrow. "Link them. Cover them. So we never have to step out into a storm." Jonas laughed, his familiar gentle chuckle. "Ellie, we're not ants living underground. People need open space, need room. Besides, in Frostbend, everyone's used to it. When winter comes, we just deal with it." But Eleanor could not forget it. When they returned to Frostbend Valley, where the wind was knife-sharp and snow could swallow an entire road overnight, a tiny seed had taken root in her mind. She began quietly observing every gap between house and barn, between kitchen and stable, between the buildings that forced people to step into deadly cold just to do the simplest tasks. Years later, when Jonas died on a blizzard night, only 30 steps from the door, the memory of that Vermont bridge returned with painful clarity. And from that moment, the seed that had seemed romantic and naive truly began to sprout. Only Rusty, the big old cat that always twined around her legs, understood that the woman was planning something bigger than herself. He didn't understand drawings or grief, but he knew one thing. When Eleanor had a purpose, she would not give up. And for a cat that had chosen its owner with every survival instinct, that was enough. Montana Territory, Frostbend Valley, last December, still lingered in the memory of the people here like a white scar. Frostbend was known as the place where winter arrived earlier than anywhere else, and only left after it had drained every ounce of strength from people. November could bring blizzards strong enough to bury entire roofs. January was so cold that the needles on old thermometers froze because they could no longer measure it. And everyone here was familiar with heartbreaking stories of people collapsing on the short distance between house and stable. The valley was shaped wrong for human presence. A deep hollow in the mountains that trapped cold air like a bowl holds water, creating temperature inversions that sometimes made the valley floor 40 degrees colder than the slopes above. Sane people did not choose Frostbend Valley to build a home, but the Whitford family had never been considered sane in that sense. Jonas Whitford's ancestor, Archibald Whitford, a Scotsman, arrived in 1861 with the stubbornness of a Highlander and the blind faith that no place was too harsh to be conquered by man. He built a cabin, cleared land, grew grain in the biting wind, and raised children who grew up to the sound of storms. He lived to 80 and died in the very cabin he had built with his own hands, never having spent a single winter anywhere else. His son continued the same way, adding 2 rooms to the cabin, building a new barn, reinforcing the roof, and teaching his son Jonas that cold was not an enemy but a problem. Solve it and live, fail and die. Jonas grew up with that philosophy and passed it on to Eleanor when they married, and she had believed it until last winter. When Jonas went to check the barn roof on a windy night, Eleanor thought he would return in a few minutes as always. That distance, no more than 20 steps, was one any Frostbend resident considered meaningless, too short for anything to happen. But in Frostbend Valley, where wind could shift in seconds, and snow poured down like floodwater, 20 steps were enough to separate life from death. Jonas never came back. They found him the next morning, frozen under a thin layer of snow right in the middle of the path from house to barn. The whole town mourned for Eleanor, a thin, quiet woman suddenly widowed in a place where winter was always fiercer than human grief. They brought bread, dry firewood, words of comfort, but no one understood what was igniting inside her. To them, Jonas's death was just another winter tragedy. To Eleanor, it was the collapse of the belief the Whitford family had passed down for 3 generations. Cold was not just a problem. It was a killer, and it had killed her husband over a tiny gap between 2 roofs. So while neighbors hoped she would sell the land, pack up, and leave Frostbend Valley for an easier life, Eleanor looked at the white expanse in front of her porch and thought of a vow. A vow she never spoke aloud, but etched into every heartbeat. No one will ever die again just because two roofs are a few dozen steps apart. In Frostbend Valley, where snow could bury anything, that vow was the one thing that would not be buried. And from it, Eleanor's determination began to grow cold as Montana wind, but hard as mountain stone, unshakable. The news that widow Eleanor Whitford announced she would build 2 cabins and connect them with a covered corridor spread across Frostbend Valley in a single afternoon, fast as wind whipping through a mountain pass. The first to hear it was old Hank Pierce at the end of the valley, a man who spoke only 3 times a month, but broke his rule to guffaw while retelling it. The widow Whitford's gonna build a winter palace. 2 cabins and then what? A stroll in the blizzard? The rumor reached Edwin Clark, the loudest man in the area, and the one who had mocked Eleanor for clinging on after her husband's death. Edwin stood in the middle of the market fair, hands on hips, loud enough for everyone to hear. 2 cabins? With a covered corridor? Good heavens, she must think she's the queen of blizzards. No one in Frostbend has ever done anything that foolish. A group of women nearby, who had never much liked Eleanor for her reserved ways, immediately whispered and burst out laughing, giving her a new nickname, Old Tunnel Widow. They repeated it with childish glee, never imagining that nickname would follow the valley's history in ways they could not foresee. With each passing day, the gossip grew louder. Some said Eleanor was mentally affected by Jonas's death. Others said she was trying to appear strong but would soon collapse. The more malicious claimed she was just seeking attention by doing something eccentric. No one had ever seen a small, solitary widow declare she would build such a bizarre structure it was beyond their imagination. But Eleanor did not argue. She did not explain. She did not get angry. She simply sat quietly at the kitchen table with her sketchbook, opening to pages showing 45-degree pitched roofs, posts raising the floor above the ground, louver-style vented walls, and slowly checked every detail. Rusty lay curled beside her elbow, eyes lazily slitted but ears twitching whenever the wind slammed the door. She sat like that for hours, lamplight falling on lines far sturdier than her slight frame suggested. The next morning, when the sun had barely cleared the ridge, people saw her carrying a saw, hammer, and bucket of nails into the yard. Edwin Clark stood arms folded on his porch, laughing loudly for the neighbors to hear. Here we go. Let's see how long she lasts. But Eleanor did not even glance over. She drove the first wooden stake into the frozen ground. The sound was sharp and clean, utterly unlike the mockery surrounding her. It was the sound of an unshakable decision, and when that first stake stood straight in the icy earth, no one in Frostbend Valley realized they had just witnessed the moment that would begin to change their lives forever. Eleanor built the second cabin west of the main one, about 18 feet away, close enough for easy connection, far enough to set the foundation for the covered corridor she planned next. She designed it compact, 10 feet wide, 14 feet long, with a 40-degree pitched roof so snow would slide off easily. It would serve as a workshop and auxiliary shelter during major storms. In Eleanor's eyes, this first step had to be perfect, because the entire future corridor would depend on the second cabin's structure. From the very first morning she hauled timber into the yard, Frostbend Valley residents began gathering. Some stood at a distance with arms folded, others leaned on fences, all waiting for it to collapse. Old Hank Pierce eyed the beams she raised and said just loud enough for everyone, "One windy night and it's down." Eleanor heard but did not reply. She remeasured the distance between the 4 corner posts, each exactly 10 feet across and 14 feet long. Every post was sunk 5 feet into frozen ground and pounded with a wooden mallet to ensure not even an inch of deviation. That was something Jonas had taught her. If a corner post is off by an inch, the wall will lean forever. Eleanor honored his words in every motion. Rusty followed like a strict inspector. When Eleanor raised the first crossbeam at 7 feet, the cat immediately jumped onto the frame, walking back and forth, ducking under and climbing over, as if testing stability. Whenever a beam wobbled slightly, he turned to look at her, as if reporting. On the second day, Eleanor erected the north and south wall frames. She used 8-foot pine boards, 2 inches thick, arranged in the traditional 2x4 pattern for better load bearing. Each joint was notched 1 inch deep to lock into the crossbeams, reducing the risk of strong wind popping them loose. More onlookers gathered. Everyone believed a 25-30 miles per hour gust would twist the frame. But the next morning, after a night with 32 miles per hour winds, the structure stood exactly as before. On the third day, Eleanor started the roof. She chose 40 degrees pitch because it was steep enough for snow to slide without shoveling, yet not so steep that wind would lift the sheathing. She used 12 6-foot pine boards, overlapping each by 3 inches to prevent leaks. Rusty climbed to the highest rafter and stretched out as if declaring, "This spot's good." By afternoon, the basic structure was visible. 4 solid corner posts, precisely fitted walls, evenly pitched roof, small 2x 2-foot windows facing west toward the mountains. It was not beautiful or large, but it was right. People said nothing more. They just looked, then walked away quietly, slightly unsettled because the little cabin had not collapsed as they expected. Eleanor stepped back a few paces for a final visual check. Roof straightness, corner squareness, column to beam fit. Everything snug. She did not smile, but her heart felt a little lighter. The second cabin was solid. It was only the beginning, but a beginning that, if wrong, would doom everything after. Rusty rubbed against her legs, his big tail flicking lightly in the wind, and Eleanor knew, tomorrow she would start the harder part, the part the whole valley was certain she would fail, the corridor connecting the 2 cabins. But as Jonas had taught her, one correct step at a time, and Winter could not win. And Eleanor had taken every step correctly. The corridor linking the 2 cabins was the part all of Frostbend Valley was sure Eleanor would fail at, because no one believed a slight widow could erect an 18-foot-long, 6-foot-wide structure suspended above the ground that would not be torn apart by Montana wind in a single night. But on the early morning she began, with frost still clinging to the posts and the ground cold enough to make metal brittle, Eleanor simply stood in the empty space between the cabins and breathed out slowly. This was not a sudden whim, it was 20 years of observation, memory, and relearning everything Jonas had taught her. The first step was 8 support posts, 4 on each side, spaced 6 feet apart along the corridor's length. Posts were buried 3 feet deep, with an extra foot of gravel to prevent settling. Tops cut perfectly level. Eleanor rechecked each post's height with plumb line and wooden rule, ensuring all stood exactly 2.5 feet above ground. That was the height she calculated so that knee-deep snowdrifts in winter could not block the corridor floor. Neighbors watched with arms folded, no longer laughing loudly but waiting for the first accident. Yet everything slotted into place. When Eleanor laid the 2 18-foot longitudinal beams across the supports and secured them with 6-inch nails, eyebrows began to furrow. When she added 6 cross beams spaced 2 feet apart to form the floor frame, the discomfort in their eyes grew clearer. The structure did not wobble. Rusty, as usual, was the first inspector. He leaped onto the bare frame and walked deliberately from east end to west, ears pricked to the creak of wood. When the 4th beam vibrated slightly, he stopped, turned to Eleanor, and gave a short meow as if reporting the joint needed more nails. Eleanor understood, stepped over, drove in 2 more 4-inch nails. Rusty tested again, then continued silently. That meant pass. Once the floor frame was complete, she laid the flooring with 1-inch thick pine boards, each 8 inches wide, running continuously the full length. Every board received a coat of linseed oil mixed with beeswax to repel water and reduce warping and cold. She nailed them with 3-inch nails, keeping gaps exactly 0.25 inch for expansion. People watched her methodical pace, no hurry, no hesitation, and more than a few expressions shifted from mockery to confusion. When the floor was finished, she built the walls. Eleanor did not make solid walls. She used the louver technique she had seen in Vermont. Each slat was 4 inches wide, 1 inch thick, angled 15 degrees so wind could pass through without dragging snow inside. Spacing between slats was 5 inches enough for ventilation, moisture control, and to prevent wind pressure from toppling the corridor. This detail set Frostbend Valley buzzing, because no one here had ever seen walls like that. A 40 miles per hour side wind, and those things will fly off, Edwin Clark declared loudly. But right after, a strong westerly gust rose, whistling through the louvers with a light whine, and nothing fell. Not one slat shook excessively. Not one board tore loose. Edwin stood silent for a few seconds, then turned away as if the sight offended his pride. Finally came the roof, the most critical part. Eleanor chose a 45 degrees pitch, exactly like the old Vermont covered bridges, the ideal angle for snow to slide off. She placed 12 7-foot rafters, spaced 18 inches apart, notching each 1 inch deep to lock onto the cross beams. When the roof frame rose, the onlookers grew noticeably quieter. It looked right. Solid foundation. Sturdy. Rusty climbed to the peak rafter and lay there like a small flame, tail flicking in the wind. Each strong gust made him merely turn his head, never cower or jump down. That was clear proof. The roof was strong enough. By day's end, when Eleanor nailed the final sheathing and poured melted beeswax into seams for waterproofing, the 18-foot corridor stood complete. 6 feet wide, 7 feet high, floor raised 2.5 feet, 45 degrees roof, uniform louver walls, no sway, no cracks, no misalignment, and most importantly, no collapse. The people of Frostbend Valley left quietly, mockery gone. They did not say it, but everyone understood. What they were seeing was unlike anything that had ever existed in this valley. Rusty looked up at Eleanor, eyes narrowed in satisfaction, as if he knew she had just completed the hardest part, the part that would decide survival when real winter arrived. But for Eleanor Whitford, this was only the beginning. The storm had not yet come, and she had to be ready. The light November blizzard arrived just when Eleanor needed a real test for her double cabin. From early morning, wind shifted direction, temperature dropped quickly to 20 degrees Fahrenheit, then 15 degrees Fahrenheit, and snow fell in fine layers covering the main cabin roof. Frostbend Valley residents looked out their windows at the white sky and shook their heads. Tonight we'll know. But Eleanor was not worried. As the first flakes began blowing sideways, she stepped onto the porch and looked along the 18-foot corridor linking the cabins. Every louver slat remained perfectly in place, barely vibrating in the wind. The floor, 2.5 feet off the ground, was almost untouched by snow. The corridor's 45 degrees roof began doing its job. Snow slid off immediately, never piling into heavy slabs like on traditional roofs. After just 1 hour, the surrounding ground was deeply white, yet the corridor remained clear end to end. By noon, snow fell harder. Wind rose to about 18-20 miles per hour. Valley residents watching from afar were nearly certain the corridor would be blocked solid, but it stayed open. The 15 degrees angled louvers let wind pass while deflecting most snow outward, leaving only a sugar dust coating on the wood edges. No ice formed, no moisture pooled exactly as Eleanor designed. In the afternoon, as the minor storm peaked, Eleanor decided to test it in person. She opened the main cabin door, stepped into the wooden corridor, and immediately felt the difference. Inside air was about 8-12 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than outside, enough that her breath did not instantly turn to thick frost. Wind howled outside, but inside the corridor it was only a steady light whistle as louvers redirected airflow. The wooden floor was completely dry, no puddles, no ice. Eleanor walked from one end to the other without ducking against gusts or shielding her face from snow. This was precisely what she had wanted, a passage through winter. Rusty, the unpaid but authoritative overseer, had somehow gotten there first. As she reached the middle, he was sprawled across the relatively warm floor like a lazy fox. He stretched, arched his back, then settled right in the walkway like a seal of approval. He did not curl up against cold, did not shiver, did not seek a corner, meaning the temperature was stable enough. Eleanor looked at him, then surveyed the entire corridor once more. Roof holding, walls holding, floor holding. No sign of weakness. No cracking wood, no shifted joints in the supports. She breathed deeply. The first test was over. The storm lasted only half a day, but it was a clear signal. Her design worked. And as Eleanor returned to the main cabin, snow still falling outside, for the first time in many months she felt she had taken a long stride forward in her battle against winter. Rusty remained lying in the middle of the corridor, eyes half closed in smug contentment, like an old engineer signing off on a blueprint he trusted completely. On the afternoon of December 14, the local Frostbend Valley radio broadcast the bulletin everyone dreaded. A strong low-pressure system is forming from the north. Expect a 5-day blizzard, gusts 60-70 miles per hour. Temperatures may reach -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Residents should prepare. The town practically held its breath. Anyone who had lived in Frostbend long enough knew a one-day storm was normal, 2 days dangerous. 5 days meant roofs would collapse, people would get lost, people would die. Eleanor turned off the radio, stood motionless by the window, watching the purple-gray horizon gradually swallowed by thick clouds. The corridor between the two cabins stood quiet in the snow, its roofline sharp in the fading light. She placed a hand on the window frame and whispered, "All right, let's see how much you can take." Day 1. The storm arrived exactly as forecast. From 5 a.m., wind exceeded 30 miles per hour, and snow fell so thick that within an hour the porch was white. Yet the double cabin held firm. The 45 degrees roof continuously shed snow. The 15 degrees louvers allowed wind through without forcing snow inside. Eleanor walked from main cabin to auxiliary 3 times that day, checking every corner. Inside the corridor, it was always about 10 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than outside. Wind whistled around the walls like howling. But the floor did not shake. The roof did not sag. Frostbend residents began to notice. Day 2. Snow did not let up. It thickened. Visibility dropped to 10-15 feet. Wind reached 40-45 miles per hour, lashing the valley like iron whips. While some neighbors' barns began sagging under roof load, Eleanor's corridor remained exactly as first built. Each strong gust made the louvers click lightly, but nothing cracked. Rusty, instead of hiding in the cabin, lay on a beam near a corridor window, eyes half closed, as if keeping watch over the entire structure. By afternoon, a group of villagers watched from afar in disbelief. Day 3, and it'll collapse, Edwin Clark said loudly, but his voice no longer carried certainty. Day 3. This was the day Frostbend Valley would never forget. Wind rose to 70 miles per hour overnight, speeds elsewhere called destructive. Temperature plunged to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was so cold that coughing too hard could burn the lungs. 6 homes in the valley began losing roofs that morning. 2 livestock barns had rafters snapped by wind. No one dared step outside. But Eleanor still had to inspect her creation. She opened the main cabin door and entered the corridor. Instantly, the outside wind roared against the walls, producing a growl-like sound. The wooden floor vibrated, truly vibrated, but evenly, not in dangerous lurches. The louvers took the full force, yet the 1.5-inch gaps dispersed pressure so the corridor was not blown over like solid-walled buildings. The 45 degrees roof bore heavy snow load, but snow kept sliding off so weight never accumulated too long. Eleanor walked slowly, the full length, hand on each beam as if fearing she might miss something. She felt the steady vibration sign of stable construction. At the far end, looking through the auxiliary cabin window, she saw a sight that chilled Frostbend blood. The Patterson family home 200 feet away, collapsing its roof like cardboard. Wind hurled it down without mercy. Eleanor stood still a moment, clenching her fists. Then she looked back at her corridor. Rafters still locked, beams intact, roof holding its angle. She pressed her frozen hand to a post and whispered, "Jonas, it's holding." Days 4, 5. The storm did not ease. Snow rose until the ground around the cabins reached half-door height. Wind still spiraled as if trying to rip the valley apart. But the double cabin stood. Louvers continued breaking up wind. Roof slid snow endlessly. Raised floor remained completely clear. In the final days, Frostbend residents peered through the snow curtain and understood that the thing they had mocked might be the strongest structure in the entire valley. And Eleanor, amid wind roaring as if to swallow the sky, only tightened her coat, watched the corridor trembling lightly with each gust, and whispered, "Just hold until the end of day 5, and we beat winter." And the corridor held. On the night of day 3, when the storm reached winds near 70 miles per hour, and the outside temperature held steady at -40 degrees Fahrenheit, Eleanor thought the worst was over until a violent pounding on the door rang out, drowning even the howling wind. She cracked open the main cabin door just a sliver, afraid of the gust rushing in, and there stood the Collins family. All 6 of them, faces pale from cold, coats covered in snow, eyes wide with panic. "Mr." Collins gasped. Words broken. "Roof. Gone. Whole house about to collapse." Eleanor pulled them inside at once. While they were still shaking, she motioned with her hand. "Follow me." Then she led the entire family through the 18-foot corridor. Though the storm outside was tearing the valley apart, the corridor only vibrated lightly like a resonating string. When they reached the auxiliary cabin, she started a fire immediately, gave blankets to the two youngest children, and Mrs. Collins sobbed while clutching her kids close. But before they could settle, a second pounding came weaker, smaller, but no less urgent. When Eleanor opened the door, the two Bramley children stood before her. The 9-year-old holding the hand of the 6-year-old, faces purple, scarves long gone. We lost our parents," the older one said, voice trembling more from cold than fear. Eleanor asked nothing more. She pulled both inside, wrapped her own coat around the younger one, then hugged them both as she led them down the corridor to the auxiliary cabin. As she sat them by the stove, she heard Rusty snort once, and the big cat immediately curled up near the children, rubbing against their legs as if to reassure them. "It's okay. You're safe here." The kids instantly hugged him. Just minutes later, a third knock sounded. This one so faint that Eleanor had to press her ear to the door to be sure it was human. When she opened it, old Gus, the man who lived alone at the north end of the valley, collapsed into her arms, covered in snow and straw. "I got trapped in the barn," he wheezed. "Whined. Took half of it. Lucky the cows blocked it." He could barely stand. Eleanor supported him, half carrying him through the corridor. The corridor floor remained dry and solid, letting them walk without slipping. When Gus saw the auxiliary cabin, tears welled in his eyes. "I thought I wouldn't make it through the night." But the storm had not released Frostbend Valley. Near midnight, as Eleanor had just set a pot of potato soup on the stove and arranged people to rest in shifts around the cabin, a fourth knock came completely different from the others. Strong, rapid, desperate. She opened the door, and there stood Edwin Clark, the man who had mocked her the loudest. But he no longer had that confident air. Wind battered him sideways. In his arms was his 3-year-old child, face bruised red from cold. Behind him, his wife, nearly knocked over by gusts, clung to his coat to keep from being swept away. "Please." Edwin managed only those 2 words. Eleanor said nothing, just grabbed his wrist and pulled him inside. She shut the door, latched it fast, then took the child from his arms. "Follow me," she said for the 4th time that night. And they went through the corridor, still standing firm amid the earth-tearing storm. Once inside the auxiliary cabin, no one spoke anymore. No one had the strength. Only the quiet crying of children and the wind howling outside reminded them they were surviving thanks to 18 feet of wood built by a widow's trembling but resolute hands. By dawn of day 4, Eleanor's 2 cabins and corridor sheltered a total of 18 people. The 6 Collinses, the 2 Bramley children, old Gus, the 4 Clarks, plus 5 more adults from homes that collapsed after midnight and came knocking for refuge. She organized everything quickly. 2 strong people took turns tending the fire. 3 handled a large pot of soup from potatoes, beans, and smoked bacon. The rest found places to lie down in shifts, sharing warmth with blankets and coats. She rationed food clearly. Children first, elderly next. Healthy adults ate least to leave more for those still shivering. Rusty became the soul of the cabin. He moved from group to group, rubbing a crying child's hand, climbing into Gus's lap as he breathed heavily, curling on Mrs. Clark's lap as if saying, "You're alive. Don't be afraid." The kids called him the little guard, and the adults believed his calm helped them hold their spirits through the darkest night of the storm. And while the wind outside roared like a beast, inside the small cabin flickering with firelight, Eleanor looked at the crowded but safe people and understood that her creation was no longer a strange dream. It had become the boundary between life and death for the entire valley. After exactly 5 days of the storm ravaging Frostbend Valley, the wind finally weakened, snow stopped falling, and the sky opened to a pale blue patch after an endless white curtain. When the refugees in Eleanor's cabin opened the door and stepped out, the sight made everyone freeze. Nearly the whole valley had turned into a chest-deep sea of snow, dotted with collapsed roofs, barns broken in half, fences flattened, and paths completely buried. Frostbend Valley had not seen destruction like this in decades, but amid the ruins, Eleanor's double cabin stood intact as if the storm had merely brushed past without touching it. The corridor roof still held its 45 degrees pitch, clear of snow. The 2.5-foot raised floor remained open and dry. The louver walls carried only a thin dusting of white. The entire 18-foot frame stayed perfectly straight. No sway, no shift. Those who had survived inside stepped out and looked at the structure like a true miracle. A few other Frostbend residents waded through snow from afar, their eyes holding no trace of mockery, only stunned gratitude. And among them appeared Edwin Clark, carrying his little daughter who had finally fallen asleep after days of terror. He no longer had his usual arrogant posture, but bowed his head low before Eleanor, his voice hoarse and halting. If it weren't for you, my daughter would be dead." He swallowed hard. I was wrong. I mocked you. I thought." He couldn't continue. Eleanor looked at him. Then at the little girl resting on her father's shoulder, hair full of frost. She did not reproach, did not boast, did not mention past taunts. She only said one sentence, voice soft but clear as a hammer striking pine. "I just did what winter forces people to do. Connect." No one replied. No one dared, because they knew she was right. Frostbend winter was not something to fight with brute strength. It only yielded to what was built with intelligence, persistence, and deeper understanding of cold than anyone else in the valley. Those who had once laughed at her now stood silent, like rocks worn down by the storm's erosion of pride. The Pattersons, whose roof collapsed on day 3, said through tears, "This structure saved us. Without you, Frostbend Valley would have many dead." One by one, people came to her cabin door and bowed in thanks. No fuss, no exaggeration. The storm had taught them the cruelest lesson. What they once called madness turned out to be the only thing that stood when the whole valley broke. Rusty stepped out the door, sat in the snow, tail flicking lightly as if making one final check of what the storm left behind. The cat raised its head, eyes narrowed at the corridor, standing tall behind. It didn't understand human thanks or apologies, but it understood the most important thing. This place had protected its pack, and that was all it needed. In the strange calm, amid the chaos of 5 days, Frostbend Valley stood before Eleanor not to judge anymore, but to acknowledge. They had laughed at her. Now they owed her the lives of the entire valley, and the double cabin behind her, having just saved 18 people, was the clearest answer winter ever gave them. When spring arrived, snow began melting into thin streams running down the hillsides, and Frostbend Valley looked as if waking from a long coma. Roofs torn off by the storm still lay scattered, fences snapped like matchsticks, livestock barns mere frames. But amid it all, Eleanor's double cabin stood firm, a landmark of survival through the harshest winter in years. And from there, the spread began. The first to knock was Hank Pierce, the man who had stood arms folded, mocking her the most. He held a small notebook and pencil, speaking in a lowered voice. "If you're willing, show me how to build that corridor." No pride, no half-joke. Eleanor looked at him a moment, then nodded. "If you want to learn, I'll teach you." After Hank came the Bramleys, then the Collinses, then 3 more families from the south end of the valley. Within 2 weeks of the storm, over a dozen people asked her to teach them how to build a connecting corridor exactly 18 feet long, 6 feet wide, floor raised 2.5 feet, 15 degrees angled louver walls, 45 degrees roof, just like her original design. Eleanor kept no secrets. She did not call it an invention or her own creation. She only said, "If it helps people survive, anyone who needs it has the right to know." So she taught, for free. She showed how to make joints that wouldn't crack at -40 degrees Fahrenheit, how to notch rafters 1 inch deep to withstand 70 miles per hour's wind, how to space louver slats exactly 1.5 inches to disperse wind pressure. Occasionally, Rusty would jump onto a beam while she was instructing as if he were the official technical assistant. The spread did not stop at Frostbend Valley. A trader from North Dakota passing through for firewood saw the structure, asked questions, and carried the story home. Then a letter arrived from Wyoming asking if she could share her sketches. 2 weeks later, mail came from Colorado High Plains. "We heard about your winter corridor. Every year old folks die lost in blizzards. Please tell us, can this design handle strong winds?" Word spread as fast as winter wind itself. Some places called the structure winter spine. others warm bridge. But when the local Montana paper ran a 2-page feature at the end of April, they chose a headline the whole valley took pride in: The Widow Who Outsmarted Winter. They recounted how Eleanor lost her husband over just 20 steps in a blizzard, how she built 2 cabins and connected them with an 18-foot corridor, how the structure survived a 5-day storm, while homes across the valley collapsed en masse. The article spread to neighboring states. Many towns called Frostbend Valley headquarters asking, "Is it true a widow built a passage that survives 70 miles per hour's winds?" Soon places began erecting double cabins from the drawings she sent. Before long, in North Dakota, you saw long corridors linking houses to chicken coops. In Wyoming, families connected homes to food cellars. In Colorado, people built twin cabin models against mountain winds. All bore traces of Frostbend Valley. Some builders offered payment. Even small towns suggested buying rights. Eleanor refused every time. "I built it to live. I teach, so others don't die. That's enough." And in a rare spring, when Frostbend Valley heard no more mockery, no more doubt, only the passing whisper, "If winter strikes again, do it, Mrs. Whitford's way." The double cabin, once ridiculed, had become the standard for survival in the North. The whole valley knew it, and they were grateful to the small widow who taught them to connect before winter could separate any more lives. Eleanor Whitford lived another 20 years after that fateful white storm. 2 decades that everyone in Frostbend Valley admitted. Without her, many families would not have survived to see spring return. Every winter she still walked the 18-foot corridor, placing her hand on each darkened beam, as if touching the memory of Jonas and her old vow. No one will ever die just because 2 roofs are a few dozen feet apart. In 1915, on a calm but cold January evening, she passed away in her sleep, right in the main cabin where she and Jonas had begun their new life. People said it was a rare winter without major storms, as if Frostbend Valley itself bowed in farewell to the woman who taught the land to respect human life. Rusty lived a few more years after her. The big, smart, character-filled cat continued wandering the old corridor, lying in the exact spots he had once inspected for his owner. When his time came, the valley people, especially the children, carried him to bury beside her, under the birch tree where Eleanor used to sit on windless, sunny days. The marker over his grave bore just 4 words the kids requested. Rusty, he stood guard. In 1916, Frostbend Valley voted to erect a memorial plaque at the entrance to the double cabin. The pine board, letters carved deep by tools brought by the survivors themselves, read clearly, Eleanor Whitford. She built warmth when others built doubt. No one in town opposed it. Not one person. Because the 18 survivors of that great storm were all there, and everyone knew that without her, the number would have been 0. Eleanor's double cabin, though restored many times by the Collins family, kept its original structure. 45 degrees pitched roof, 2 5-foot raised floor, 15 degrees angled louver rows, and the pine posts she had personally notched in 1893. Engineers called it a survival design ahead of its time. The locals simply called it the life-saving bridge. By the 1,930 seconds, as roads expanded, visitors began coming to Frostbend Valley just to see the double cabin on the hillside where 18 people and 1 cat had sheltered through 5 long days in the great blizzard of Frostbend. They stepped into the corridor, touched the smooth, polished pine, and always fell silent for a long moment, as if hearing the 70 miles per hour's winds that once struck the louver walls yet could not topple them. Some even cried not from the cold, but because they understood this was the remnant of a woman once considered mad. At Frostbend Elementary School, every year when the Montana history lesson reached the chapter on blizzards, the teacher led students to stand inside the double cabin. Mrs. Parker, 3rd-generation descendant of the Bramleys, always said one line the children never forgot. This is where a stubborn widow saved the entire valley with 2 cabins and an idea once mocked. The kids touched the beams, looked out where winds still whipped snow sideways, and learned a lesson no textbook taught, that persistence can sometimes be stronger than winter itself. And as Frostbend Valley entered the new century, people realized Eleanor's legacy was not just a wooden structure, it was a philosophy of existence. Connect and live, separate and die. Anyone who passed through the double cabin felt it. Adults walked through with respect, children with wide imagination, visitors with admiration, and Frostbend residents always whispered each winter, "We're still here this season, thanks to Eleanor." And whenever a storm rose over the valley, when temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, you could see lights from wooden corridors linking roofs, dozens of identical structures, all tracing back to the idea a once-mocked widow dared to build. That was how Eleanor Whitford continued to live in this valley. Not through monuments, not through songs, but through an 18-foot passage that saved lives and still keeps doing so to this very day. Thank you for following the story. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to the channel to support us. See you in the next videos.